All right, thank you everyone. Unfortunately, I'm going to be speaking in English, so if you need translations, you need to activate the device and put it on channel 1, I believe. 1 is for English, 2 for Spanish. 1, right, I got it. Yeah, okay, good. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be here. My name is Amol Mehra. I'm the executive director of ICAR, the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable. We're a Washington, D.C.-based policy organization working on business and human rights policy both in the U.S. and across the world. I am thrilled to be here at the invitation of ICIP. Maria and Pablo, thanks for all the hard work in putting this event together. I'll be serving as moderator for this session entitled National Action Plans on Business and Human Rights, Lights and Shadows, which is an evocative title. So hopefully we have lots of discussion about both the dark and the light of the National Action Plan agenda. I've been asked by the organizers just to note a few changes on the agenda. You'll see that we were supposed to have a representative from the Colombian government joining us, but unfortunately, due to some connectivity issues, that person's not going to be able to join us via Skype. But instead, we have the one and only Maria Prandi, who will be speaking today and coming in last minute. We're very appreciative for that, to discuss some of the developments here in Spain on the National Action Plan agenda. So I think, in fact, it'll be perhaps a more, I don't want to say more interesting, but an interesting and relevant discussion for the audience that we have here today. I'll also note that I want at all points each of you to think about questions and comments that you'd like to make. We'll move through a set of presentations by our speakers here, and then we'll go right to the floor to enable as much dialogue and conversation as we can. So just note those questions down, and we'll be coming to you within the next hour, so we have a full amount of time for the discussion. So, without further ado, I'm just going to set a little bit of the stage for the conversation that we'll have, and then I'll introduce each speaker to make some of their remarks. We have 2 government representatives here, so please do, in fact, ask them discreet and direct questions about the work of their government on this issue. It'll be really helpful, I think, for the Catalan government to sort of understand what's been happening, and these are very much leaders in the business and human rights arena, both the UK and Finland represented with us today. So I just put together a few slides just to situate the discussion, to make sure we're all understanding what we're talking about and the language we're using. You know, in the previous discussion, we talked about the UN guiding principles, and I just want to make sure all of us are on the same page about what they mean, what they refer to, and then where the National Action Plan agenda was born. So I'll quickly run through this slide. In 2011, the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva endorsed the UN guiding principles on human rights. And this was a significant moment because it was the first time the international community had recognized a common set of principles to deal with business and human rights issues. The guiding principles are broken into 3 pillars. You've heard them mentioned in the previous discussion. The first applies to governments, that governments have a duty to protect human rights in relation to business activity. And they engage in this duty by enacting laws, by enforcing laws, by regulations, and other incentive structures. The second pillar is the responsibility to respect, and this pillar is very much tied at corporations. Here it elaborates different types of policies, processes, and mechanisms by which companies can engage in their responsibility to respect. Again, noting that the language of duty applying to the states, the government has a legal duty, and then again, the decision made here to focus on responsibility of the corporation instead of the legal duty. And then we go to the third pillar, which is about remedies. This is often called the forgotten pillar, or of the 3-legged stool of the guiding principles. And this applies to both states and business. And generally, it creates mechanisms at the state level, or argues that mechanisms should be created at the state level, including courts, national contact points, or national human rights institutes, etc. But also elaborates a set of company-level mechanisms that could be created to resolve human rights cases. And these are often known as company-level or operational grievance mechanisms. So that's the guiding principles. After their endorsement in 2011, governments moved to sort of implement the guiding principles, but this all crystallized in 2014 in a resolution at the UN Human Rights Council that called for all member states to develop national action plans on business and human rights. The UN Working Group, which we just mentioned before, was also tasked with developing guidance on what that national action plans should include. And a particular member of the UN Working Group has been leading this effort, Dante Peche from Chile. At the same time, there's been echoes of this call at various other intergovernmental bodies, including the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. There, they noted the support for national action plans on responsible business conduct. So we're seeing sort of a terminology difference. Business and human rights at the UN, responsible business conduct at the OECD. And the Working Party at the OECD is collaborating with the UN Working Group in this effort. At the same time, and very interesting to note, particularly in the context of supply chains, the G7 and the G20, in the G7 Leaders Declaration from 2015, it actually called for leadership on the development of national action plans. Just to note that Germany hosts the G20 this year with a discrete focus on supply chains. So, I think we'll see some progress happening in those settings too. Just to provide more of a lay of the land, these are some of the national action plans that have been completed. You'll see I've put a nice cuvée or bottle of champagne here to celebrate the governments that have in fact engaged and completed their national action plan, 2 of which are at this table with me here today. And if all goes well, maybe tonight I'll buy you a glass of champagne to toast your success in completing the national action plans. You'll see that there's not that many compared to how many are engaging in the process. And this is not a full list. This is a representative list of the governments that have started national action plans. So only a handful have actually completed them. One of the things we at ICAR have done with the Danish Institute for Human Rights is pushed a toolkit, a set of guidelines by which we believe governments should engage in their national action plan processes. One of the prerequisites that we'd like to see in all national action plans is a baseline assessment. We believe that for a government to chart a plan that has discrete action and commitments, they need to understand where they are now, what the status quo is. A baseline assessment, we believe, helps do that. It maps the laws, the policies that exist, the gaps in protection, and then helps set a chart for where to go from there. You'll see a bunch of the different, I can share these slides, but a bunch of the different efforts underway there. For instance, in Mexico, Poder, a civil society group, has published a shadow baseline assessment. In Chile, in fact, the government is working very closely on a baseline assessment. So many efforts there to provide some status quo assessment of where things are. I'll also just take it out of the EU context. Interesting to note that national action plans are not Europe-specific. In the ASEAN region, there's been some support for the development of national action plans and also regional action plans, which is very interesting. In the African Union, there's been a partnership to develop regional guidance on national action plans. And at the OAS, the Organization of American States, there's been resolutions that have mentioned national action plans. And then here, let's bring it home. At the Council of Europe in 2016, there was a recommendation on human rights in business that called for all member states to develop national action plans and to think about review mechanisms for these action plans. Again, at the EU, there was a call in 2011 from the European Council to develop national action plans, and the Dutch presidency just last year held close meetings to track and exchange NAP's experiences. So that's sort of the lay of the land, and this perhaps sets us up very well to go into our discussion on lights and shadows. We have, as I mentioned, 2 governments with us here, and Maria, who is discussing the Spanish process as well. But let's start with the UK. And Stephen, I'm going to pull up your slides. You'll have all of the bios of the speakers in your folder, except for perhaps Maria. Oh, she's in there? Okay, great. So I encourage you to read them. They're in Spanish, so I'm not going to read them. But do please read these. You'll see. Oh, in Catalan? Okay, thank you, Doug, for pointing out another error that I made. I encourage you to read them. You'll see the depth of experience that our speakers have here, and I encourage you to engage with them over the lunch session or throughout the next day or two. So first up, let me introduce Stephen Lowe, who is the Director of Business, Human Rights and Freedom of Expression at the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Stephen, why don't you talk to us about the UK's experience on national action plans, some of the lessons you've learned, and then we'll go from there. I'm going to pull up your slideshow as we speak.
Thank you very much, Amal. I also wanted to begin by adding to your thanks to the organisers for the invitation, and particularly to Pablo and Marta for their help. It doesn't, like millions and millions of other Brits, it doesn't take much to persuade me to come to Spain, but they certainly made it very easy. And also, one of the problems with doing things like this is that you sort of sit in London, you prepare a speech, and then you fly out to Barcelona and sit in the audience and listen to Maurizio say everything that you were going to say. And it'd probably be easier if I just read out Maurizio's speech again, because I agree with pretty much everything he said. But what I'm going to talk about particularly is the UK experience of developing a national action plan. And I will also, again, thanks to Maurizio for saying that it would be interesting to see what I had to say on Colombia. I did check my speech to see if it would be interesting to see what I had to say on Colombia, and I hope it will be. So I'll talk on that as well, particularly in the absence of a Colombian representative on the panel. So, national action plans. And I hope that our UK experience is going to contain more lights than shadows, but we'll see. The global response, it's already been documented this morning, but the global response on responsible business has been a very long journey, a long time coming. Back in the last century, talking about, as was said, talking from the 1970s onwards, and the Global Compact, right up to the UN Guiding Principles in 2011. And it's a journey which has sadly been marked along the way by disasters such as the tragedies at Bhopal and Rana Plaza, as well as countless other instances of human rights abuses. And the UN Guiding Principles agreement in 2011 gave us an opportunity to address this, working hand in hand with business and civil society. They provide a framework which, if properly implemented, can deliver real change. So the UK was very pleased to be the first country to implement the UNGPs through the development of a national action plan, which was launched on 4th of September 2013. And then we updated the plan last year. On the 12th of May, we published an updated version. There were some key messages in our original national action plan. I think in particular the statement that the two ministers that you can see there, the Foreign Minister and the Business Secretary, made, that the respect for human rights and the promotion of business go hand in hand. And I think it's a very important element of business and human rights that human rights are not seen as barriers to commercial success. They're seen as part and parcel of commercial and development and prosperity. We also based our national action plan around the three pillars that Amal's already laid out, the protect, respect and remedy. And in using the action plan, we tried to set out some of the clear commitments from government and the expectations that government has of business, as well as the commitments that government was going to make about how to help business meet its responsibility. One of the key factors in the development of our national action plan was the consultation process. We worked with business and civil society to understand the expectations and the limitations of what was achievable, and particularly to use the expertise which exists outside government. I mean, it's important that a national action plan is a national plan and not a government plan. I think importantly, it's also worth noting that the action plan was the product of a number of government departments, although the Foreign Office and the business ministers were the ones who signed it off and put their name on the cover. It was a whole of government document, and around 10 departments very actively involved in both its development and implementation, and continue to be so. One of the 20 commitments we made in our original action plan was to produce an updated version just over 2 years after the initial publication. Now, it's quite unusual, in my experience, to review a policy document so soon after publication. But I think in this case, it reflected partly the fact that we were the first to produce a plan, and therefore we had little to measure our work against or learn lessons from. So when we came to update the action plan, we followed a similar approach in terms of the format of the document, again around the 3 pillars, and in terms of the consultation and cross-government working. But we also took some lessons on board from our original National Action Plan, the way it had been perceived internationally and domestically. One of those was that we've been diligent in trying to address the 20 commitments that we've made in the action plan, but we'd not done well enough in communicating what we'd done. That was one of the lessons we got back. We held a big consultation exercise for civil society, business, etc., and we set out. And one of the comments we got back from civil society was, so that's what you've been doing for the last 2 years. We hadn't been communicating our successes enough. We'd also, I think, taken on some tasks which were better really carried out by others. So, for example, I think when advice to business is often best developed by those within the sector, not by governments, those who understand the challenges that their particular sector faces. And I think in updating the action plan, we had a better understanding of the role that government can play, which is partly an encouraging, but it's also a convening role of bringing the relevant people together. One of the other factors we found was that, I think just roll on, sorry. One of the other factors we found was that since we produced our action plan, in fact, since the UNGPs have been developed, the landscape of business and human rights had changed considerably in that 4 or 5 years. I think there's been a greater emphasis on the role of reporting and transparency. And we've been supporting the development of something called the Corporate Human Rights Benchmarking Initiative, which is an initiative to assess the performance of the largest companies in several sectors against human rights criteria. And this allows investors and customers and shareholders to see how a company is performing. And we hope that will result in a race to the top. You know, business CEOs are very competitive people by their very nature, and if they see a league table, they want to be at the top and not the bottom. As a government, we've also made changes to the Companies Act around corporate reporting, and significantly, I think, introduced the transparency and supply chains provision in the Modern Slavery Act, which has already been mentioned several times this morning, gratifyingly. And that requires companies over a certain size to report on the steps they've taken to tackle slavery, both throughout their operations and through their supply chains. We also supported the development of the Reporting Accountability Framework Initiative, again something that Maurizio mentioned, which uses the UNGPs as a template for corporate reporting and assists companies in meeting their obligations and their reporting requirements. This sort of reporting and transparency has the potential to drive better corporate human rights performance without the need for heavy legislation, which can often place disproportionate burdens on business, and at the end of the day doesn't necessarily reduce human rights abuses or help victims. And the aim should be to improve corporate behaviour, not simply to punish those who fail to meet the required standards. Having said that, we do need to have adequate provision of remedy, and I think it's recognised as the weaker pillar, both judicial and non-judicial. In the UK, our OECD National Contact Point is recognised as one of the most effective of its type. Again, in the Modern Slavery Act, we've shown that where we identify a clear legal requirement, then we're prepared to legislate to deal with that. And Amol also mentioned the Council of Europe recommendations. Again, that's very heavily focused on remedy, access to justice, and I would recommend people to look at that. Moving forward, we'd like to see more countries putting in place frameworks for the implementation of the UNGPs, particularly through national action plans or similar mechanisms. And as was mentioned, we've been very pleased to have been able to work with the Colombian government and help them become the first country outside Europe to have a national action plan. We've also worked with others inside and outside Europe and will continue to do so. And on Colombia, you know, there was a question earlier and Maurizio referred to it. In fact, one of the last things I was doing before leaving for Barcelona, sort of sitting at about midnight on Tuesday, whenever it was writing something for our embassy in Bogota about the connections between business and human rights and peace and stability, and how we see the National Action Plan that we've assisted with is providing a framework for good corporate governance. And if you have that, that framework that promotes long-term stability, it encourages inward investment, and that's sort of a positive cycle towards economic prosperity, stability, etc. I also work within my patch on democracy, democracy promotion, and we're looking again at how democracy contributes to prosperity. We have a very good UK example, in fact, around Northern Ireland, which spent not quite as long as Colombia, but a considerable amount of time with sectarian violence. And one of the benefits of that, the peace dividend really, is that if you have stability, there's been a real boom in inward investment and business. So we have a lot of lessons around democracy ourselves, and we're very pleased to have been able to help Colombia with that. Business and human rights, I think, provides the framework for a range of policy measures. And one lesson we learned in developing our National Action Plan and its update is that such a plan is not necessarily a document for making policy, but for setting out expectations and drawing together in one place the wide range of activities which may already be taking place across government, which can be classed as business and human rights work, even if they've not previously been given that label. The UK Modern Slavery Act is a case in point. We did not even mention this piece of legislation in our National Action Plan when we first published it in 2013. It wasn't regarded as being a business and human rights piece of legislation. Those developing the Act in our Home Office were focusing very much on the crimes of human trafficking, better law enforcement, victim protection. And they weren't going to initially think of legislating around business and supply chains. However, there was very strong lobby from civil society, parliamentarians, and actually support from business to recognize that supply chains could be channels for slavery and trafficking, and that simple legislation supported by business action could help identify and tackle what our Prime Minister has called the greatest human rights challenge of our time. And I think it's now there's a recognition within government that actually the Transparency in Supply Chains initiative, which was one of the last pieces to go into the Act, could turn out to be one of the most effective and transformative parts of the Act. So to sum up, our work on business and human rights will continue. As we look to develop new trade relationships, it's going to be important that these are consistent with the commitments we've set out in our national action plans. And the scrutiny of our performance on business and human rights will also continue. Only last week, a committee of our two houses of Parliament called ministers from 4 government departments, including mine, before them to examine how we were implementing our National Action Plan, and they focused on the guidance we were giving to business, what we were doing internationally, Remedy, our Ministry of Justice was there, and the Modern Slavery Act, and how we were implementing that. So the Home Secretary was there as well. We'll also continue to work with business, encourage reporting and transparency, some of the examples I've mentioned before, and promote examples of best practice. And we'll continue to fund programs around the world, both with national human rights institutions, as we've done in Colombia and we've done in Malaysia and other places, and corporate initiatives like the benchmarking and the RAFI reporting framework. And we'll also continue to work with human rights defenders, which are often overlooked. And we want eventually to continue to show that the companies which will thrive in the long term are those who respect human rights. Again, it's not the trade-off, it's all working in the same direction. We'll continue to work with other governments, share our experience and provide our assistance, and to help with the UN Guiding Principles becoming embedded in government policy and business practice across the world. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Stephen. And I just also want to recognize the UK government was the first country to release a national action plan. And as a first mover, it was also the first to open itself up to scrutiny from civil society and the business community. So it is really commendable to see the leadership and engagement to continue to develop this business and human rights agenda in the UK, to develop a second national action plan or an update, and then to also, I think, which is very unique, and I hope we get into this in the questions, explore a range of options to drive progress on business and human rights. Stephen mentioned benchmarking. He also mentioned working with companies. They also mentioned transparency. So we're seeing the UK perhaps sort of, we're seeing the UK elaborate a whole host of different actions to move this agenda forward, and that's something to take note of as well. So Stephen, I'm gonna hold off my initial question to you until we hear from a few other speakers on the panel, if that's okay. Linda Pirto is the Minister of, I have to go to the English version. Okay, the advisor, sorry. Yeah, okay, I'm jet lagged. The advisor at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment of Finland. And Linda, I've just given you a promotion, so it's... Okay, I'm gonna open your slides while you take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the promotion. My name is Linda Pirto, I'm from Finland, and I'm responsible for a responsible business conduct policy, including business and human rights in Finland. And I worked with business and human rights issues since 2012. And today I'm going to talk about our perspective, and I forgot to mention my thanks for the organizers. So thanks. Let's continue. Next slide, please. So I don't know how well you can see this picture. I wanted to use colors, but now I realized that that was a mistake. But anyway, I wanted to start with a description of our ministries and who does what on responsible business conduct or business and human rights. So as you see, or hopefully see, different ministries have different responsibilities, and my task is to coordinate the work. But everyone has their own responsibilities. Next slide, please. So how our action plan came to be. We want to be a good pupil in the European Union, so when the Commission asked for the national action plans to be drafted, we wanted to do that. So our then government committed to producing an app in its 2012 Responsible Business Conduct Action Plan. So we nominated a working group consisting of different representatives from different ministries. In fact, all ministries were involved in the preparation of the action plan, and it took a year. And we had several stakeholder engagement sessions in between. First, we did this kind of like a baseline analysis, which is like a 40-page long document in Finnish, which goes through all our policies and regulation and laws regarding business and human rights in Finland. And we asked our stakeholders whether we had forgotten something and what we should then, where the gaps are. And then after that, drafted the actual action plan, which is available also in English. So the end product, the action plan, was then published in May 2014 and then approved by the then government in September 2014, so a year after the UK. And just a very brief overview of our action plan, because I assume that not all of you have read it, and no worries. It consists of 5 different sections, kind of alignment of our international activities, state as an economic actor, building dialogue, roundtables, training and guidance, and then remedies. So what has been happening since 2014? When we were preparing the action plans, one of the biggest issues we noticed was that the business and the NGO, civil society, trade unions were not in a dialogue between themselves at all. They were very far away from each other with their views, and we were somewhere in the middle. So that's why we thought that it's very important that we have to build some kind of a dialogue between the different parties and get them into the same room and talk about what the challenges are and what is expected of companies and what in practice they can then do. So we had a successful result with the grocery chains, NGOs and labor organizations, where we were able, after a year of negotiations, to reach a kind of a shared view on what our grocery chains should do in regards of their supply chains. After that, we started a dialogue with the textile industry, had a few meetings, but then discovered that, first of all, our textile companies are very small, so they don't have the same resources at all as grocery chains have. And, well, I guess it can be said that they just didn't see the added value on having a dialogue with us or with the civil society. So if they change their minds, they're more than happy to contact us and continue, but we had some dialogue, but it didn't go that far. At the moment, we are having a dialogue with Finnish companies who produce or have some activities in risk countries, where we are talking about direct human rights impacts. So a bit of a new approach, but very heavy topic. We put a lot of effort on training and guidance. Our embassies provide these responsible business conduct country reports for trade missions, and these reports are publicly available in Finnish online. But this is something that companies keep asking us. This is one of the biggest issues for companies, to get country-relevant information on each country and what the human rights issues are. We provide training for companies and public officials, and we have done a range of studies ranging from supply chain demands to global legal development, trade mission needs, use of social criteria and public procurement, how the stakeholders are viewing that our local companies are doing regarding responsible business conduct and business and human rights. Remedy side, we at the University of Helsinki did a study for us on how the current Finnish legislative framework is in regards of extraterritorial business and human rights issues. And it showed that our current system doesn't really recognize especially supply chain human rights issues. And we also did a small renewal of our OECD national contact point, so it would work more meaningfully for all stakeholders after a very hard case in 2013. Next slide, please. Our state ownership steering published a new strategy last May, and it has to be noted that we actually, as a country, own quite a lot of shares in quite big international Finnish companies. So what the state ownership strategy says has really meaning in Finland. So in this newest strategy, responsible business conduct was defined as a core value for state ownership steering. And it stated that state-owned enterprises must take human rights into account in a responsible and transparent way in their activities and in their supply chains in accordance with the UNGBs. And there has to be some kind of grievance mechanism for people to voice out their concerns in regards to business and human rights. So this was quite a heavy statement from the government towards state-owned enterprises. And finally, on the legislation side, as has been already noted, there's the new legislation on non-financial reporting. I'm very interested to see how it will affect Finnish companies. There are a lot of Finnish companies who are already reporting on responsible business conduct, but not that many who are reporting specifically on business and human rights. So I'm expecting to see a huge increase on that matter, and I'm very excited to see what the result will be. And I don't know if it's been already mentioned, but the Commission in the original directive said that they will review how well this directive has been implemented in the member states and how companies will respond to it. And then kind of they have the right to make changes in 2018. So it's really a interesting phase now. Next slide, please. Some future steps. We are still focusing very much on capacity building. We are still providing guidance and training for companies, but now we are just about to start together with Foreign Ministry, well, actually with the Foreign Ministry's money, quite a huge capacity building package for our public financing instruments on business and human rights. So this will be quite a huge project for the next couple of years. And we'll be expecting some quite big impacts that it will have. We have published guidance on how to use social criteria in public procurement in 2013, and now we need to renew it because there's the new procurement legislation going on. And one of the biggest challenges is at the moment, as Stephen already noted, that the field around business and human rights has evolved quite a lot in the past years, and now there is quite a lot of material related to business and human rights, and it's much more practical and much more detailed than the original UNGPs, which, to be frank, were quite abstract. So the OECD has published all kinds of sector-specific due diligence guidance, which is a great thing, and I think it can be an immense help for companies. But the problem is that how do we then get all the companies aware that these guidelines exist and how to make sure that they use them. I'm really happy that the OECD published the guidance on textile and shoes and the due diligence on that, but it's 188 pages long, and I haven't still figured out for myself. I've read it, I think it's great, but I honestly don't know how am I going to approach SMEs and say to them, here's an almost 200-page document, read this and be wiser. So it's a challenge, but obviously I understand the need to be specific, to give examples, but then the length of the documents is an issue. Next slide, please. Some lessons learned. Flexibility, one of the biggest lessons. If something doesn't work, you have to try something else. Trust and readiness for dialogue. What we've noticed that if some party around the table thinks that all the other parties are either idiots or people with evil intentions, it's very hard to have any kind of constructive dialogue, and this applies to all, whether they are from NGOs or companies. So if there is no willingness to hear out what the other one is saying, it's really hard to try to create something new. And everyone has to kind of see that the dialogue has some added value for them. And finally, it's very, very time-consuming and slow, all progress. And even when you have when you think that now something has been achieved, then things have already changed and you need to start over. So lots of time, very slow. That's the biggest lesson. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now let's shift over to Maria Prandi, who will discuss the efforts underway here, and then we'll go to some questions. Maria, please.
So, yes, thank you, Amor. I'm here, but I haven't prepared. I'm going to shift into Catalan because I always talk in English when I'm talking about these issues, but I'm at the parliament, so I wanted to make it in Catalan. Although some words are difficult to translate into Catalan, but they see. Bueno, no he pogut preparar res perquè no hi ha hagut temps, però sí que volia remarcar algunes de les coses que marquen una mica el procés que s'ha fet a Espanya, i perquè també hi ha gent aquí que ha participat, amb la qual suposo que després pot haver-hi una mica de diàleg, també per veure el seu punt de vista. Jo no estic com a govern parlant ara, sinó com a assistència tècnica del Ministeri d'Afers Exteriors, que ens va demanar un suport per a l'elaboració del plan. Aquest suport al principi va ser volem que ens ajudeu a fer l'esborrany. Vam dir, però l'esborrany ha de sortir dels grups d'interès i dels stakeholders, no podem fer un esborrany de res. Aleshores, a partir d'aquí es va ampliar una mica la nostra tasca, que va ser no només articular el que seria el draft, l'esborrany, sinó també veure com aquesta construcció havia de ser coconstruïda amb els altres actors. Llavors vam crear com deia la Linda, tot és molt flexible, jo crec que en el cas espanyol encara més, i vam dibuixar un pla d'acció més o menys general que ens permetia anar avançant de mica en mica amb el que havíem de fer. En aquell moment s'estava discutint el pla de UK, per tant no teníem cap pla sobre la taula sobre el qual opinar o comparar o mirar-nos-en i dir aquest model ens sembla que està bé, sinó que partíem una mica de zero i vam estar esperant molt temps la sortida del pla del Regne Unit per veure si ens donava unes llums, però no va passar. Així que vam començar per petició del Ministeri d'Afers Exteriors, de l'Oficina de Drets Humans, que és la que liderava aquest tema, amb un borrador que seguia estrictament els principis rectors. I a partir dels principis rectors deien a què es comprometia el govern, que és totalment el contrari, per exemple, del que han fet altres plans nacionals que sí s'han aprovat. En aquell moment no teníem les toolkits d'ICAR o del Danish Institute, aleshores havíem de construir una mica el que volíem fer, no hi havia pressupost, no es va poder fer un gap analysis perquè no hi havia pressupost ni temps per fer aquesta tasca, que era una mica veure els gaps entre el que hi havia a la normativa des de tots els punts de vista de tots els ministeris que pogués recolzar el Pla Nacional i el que faltava. Això no es va poder fer i es va subsanar incorporant al procés de consulta una comissió acadèmica, tenint en compte que enteníem que hi havia un corpus acadèmic important a Espanya, al país, que podia, per la seva trajectòria, havia estat treballant en aquests temes i podia aportar els seus inputs. Es van fer un procés de consulta a partir dels diferents borradors que van anar sortint. Recordo especialment una jornada sencera que es va fer a Madrid amb grups de treball per cada un dels grups de temes que havíem identificat, tot això dinamitzat per els experts de la comissió acadèmica. Vam intentar tenir una mica de visió àmplia de consulta i diàleg. Hi havia el work plan que vam definir, va ser una mica de pensar en una metodologia que evidentment havia de ser sí o no de diàleg i de consulta, uns objectius que eren tenir al final de tot aquest procés un primer pas que marqués una primera pedra en el que hauria de ser una política pública estatal en aquest sentit, és a dir, tocant moltes tecles, molts ministeris, etc. I després també s'havia de veure quins recursos hi hauria per implementar-lo. El que no es va fer, jo crec que va ser un error, va ser com es va fer en altres casos, des del principi incorporar un seguit de ministeris que havien d'estar en algun moment del procés involucrat perquè tenien competències en els temes que s'havien de tractar. No es va fer i la dificultat al final del procés va ser quan un cop vam tenir la consulta feta amb les empreses, amb les associacions empresarials, que m'agrada dir que són coses diferents, perquè moltes vegades les empreses, per la seva activitat sectorial, ja estaven una mica més habituades a participar a nivell de sector, en conferències i iniciatives sectorials que tocaven el tema dels Guiding Principles. Els sectors, les associacions empresarials no no tenien aquesta connexió exterior, per la qual no tenien la percepció de que aquest era un tema que estava a l'agenda de governs, d'empreses, d'altres organitzacions. Va costar una mica més que ho entenguessin. I després va costar moltíssim el diàleg intern amb els diferents ministeris. Realment va ser una de les tasques que va costar més perquè el desconeixement d'aquest tema i en la majoria dels casos l'interès un cop es va explicar era gran. Com deia la Linda, jo crec que la sorpresa va ser en tots els casos el gran nombre d'hores que es van dedicar a explicar, contestar, replicar, argumentar coses que no s'entenien bé, de quin era el sentit d'això, per què s'estava pensant en això, quins eren els resultats que s'esperaven, quins eren els beneficis com a país, com a sector empresarial, veure una mica que les empreses d'alguna manera també estaven demanant una clarificació per part del govern de dir què hem de fer amb això, que ens estan venint de Nacions Unides i necessitem que el govern també ens digui quin és el nostre paper. En aquell moment hi ha coses, instruments que ara hi ha que no hi havia. Per exemple, no hi havia el document RAFI de reporting en relació als guiding principles, no existia això, per tant també tot s'havia d'inventar una mica. I finalment el que va passar és que un cop vam arribar a tenir un document consensuat tant a l'exterior amb els grups, amb els stakeholders externs, tant a l'interior amb els diferents ministeris, va arribar a la taula del Consell de Ministres i per diferents pressions, tant d'una banda com de l'altra, tant de potser de la societat civil dient això no és suficient, com de les empreses això és massa, i una potser incomprensió per part en aquell moment les persones que havien de mobilitzar el dossier en concret es va paralitzar i això ja ha passat 2 anys. La setmana passada vaig estar a Madrid i he sentit veus que es torna a reprendre el tema i que hi ha esperances que hi hagi alguna cosa que es posi una altra vegada sobre la taula, no sé què és, perquè evidentment el document ha continuat estant discutint internament dins els ministeris, vull dir que serà una mica una sorpresa.
Before we go to the floor, maybe think about some questions, and then I'm just going to ask a question now to the panelists. I think it's really interesting to see all of the different national action plans and the question of who leads within government and whether that has an impact on the outcome. Even on this panel, we've had a representative from the FCO, the Foreign Affairs sort of department, and then Linda, of course, from the Ministry of the Economy. How did it come, let's say in the example of Finland, that it was the Ministry of Economy that took the lead on this effort? And do you think it would have been a different outcome had it gone to the Foreign Affairs? And Stephen, same question to you, and Maria as well. Thank you.
Good question. We actually tried to hand it out to the Foreign Ministry, but they said no. They said that you're so good at this, you can handle it. And actually, what is important to note is that our Foreign Ministry is actually like 3 different departments who are, I don't know if it's too much to say, but who are constantly fighting with each other. So it would have been very difficult for them to have made such a plan. And actually, one of their officials said to me afterwards when we had the action plans that if they would have been in charge of it, the plan would have never been made. I don't know if it's true or not, but it was easier for them that I, as an outsider, kind of said that, now we have to work together, we have to cover this and this issue, and let's do it. Okay. I don't know.
Well, I'm really sorry to hear about the infighting that goes into the Finnish government. I'm just very glad that the UK is not like that. But, I mean, I think that the fact is that business and human rights is so broad, and it covers so many different areas. I think we had about 10 departments who were actively engaged in signing off the action plan, and it could have sat anywhere. I think that the reality is often it's down to individuals, and I think there was an agreement made that the two ministries would work together, but actually it was my predecessor who was really committed on this and then led on it. And so you do need committed individuals. I think over the course of time, as we've implemented and updated, actually the dynamic has shifted depending on individuals and ministers. So there was, to be frank, there were times when the business ministry was less engaged than other times, and depending on whether it was, something their minister cared about. There were certainly times when our international development ministry was very interested and involved. There were times when, now I spend a lot of time talking to Home Office because of the Modern Slavery Act. So it does move around. I mean, it can't be almost anywhere. I think what is important, though, is this idea of making sure that all the departments that have got a role are involved. And I think, as Maria was saying, that's kind of part of the problem in Spain is not having other ministries at the table to start with. What we've also found, I think, with our action plan is, and I said in the opening remarks, that it's not a document for making policy or legislation. It's a document almost for bringing things together and setting out a framework. And what we found actually was when we were discussing the Modern Slavery Act and the Transparency in Supply Chain Initiative, we were able to say, but look, we've got this document which sets out business responsibility and actions. What we need to do is to be consistent with that. So often, if departments are signed up to this action plan, you have something which you can hold up and say, look, you're already signed up to these principles and expectations, so you need to make sure that your policy is consistent with that. And it's a good sort of framework more than anything else. But it can sit anywhere, I think.
Sí, és una bona pregunta. Jo crec que és el Ministeri d'Afers Exteriors, en aquest cas, tenia la visió per entendre que aquest tema era important. Seria important que hi hagués una implicació tant del Ministeri d'Afers Exteriors com el d'Economia, perquè per part de la percepció que tenen les empreses això donaria un aval de que això no és una bogeria del Ministeri d'Exteriors, sinó que és una cosa que recolza també un ministeri important per a les empreses, com és el Ministeri d'Economia. I a més jo afegiria una cosa, que per l'experiència que vam tenir va ser molt interessant. No només és important el Ministeri i aquesta combinació d'elements que donin pes i legitimitat a que això és un tema de l'agenda, sinó el perfil de les empreses, de la persona que lidera aquest tema o de les persones que lideren aquest tema. Jo crec que és tan o més important. En el cas espanyol va ser realment molt útil que les dues persones, Jaime Hermida i Carmelo Angulo, fossin diplomàtics de professió amb una llarga experiència de negociació en tots els nivells, tant polític com econòmic, etc. Perquè realment la diversitat de reunions i d'explicacions que s'han de fer són molt variades a diferents nivells. Inclús va haver una reunió especialment dura amb una associació empresarial. Sabíem que quan sortíssim d'allà segurament trucarien a Moncloa directament per dir això que està passant aquí, que és aquest tema. I en aquest cas es va salvar gràcies a les actituds i aptituds i capacitats de diplomàcia molt fina de les persones que estaven portant aquest tema. Jo crec que el Ministeri ha de ser una combinació de ministeris forts de cara a les empreses, però també les persones que lideren aquest tema han de ser prou flexibles, dialogants, fermes en alguns temes i saber negociar molt bé.
Now, I see 3 questions on this side. I'm encouraging people on this side to put up their hands as well. So I'll come to you next, please. So let's just go down. Okay, let's start with Doug, then Penelope, and Olga.
Thank you again to the panel. Question for Stephen Lowe. In the revised, and the perspective here is that I think everybody recognizes that the weak point in the guiding principles everywhere has been Pillar 3. In the UK revised plan, it refers to a study of issues of remediation in UK. I wonder what you can tell us about that study. Is it already public on your webpage? And if it is not, who's doing it and what's going to happen with it? And related to that, in your process of public consultation, to what extent was the judiciary and litigation lawyers on both sides involved, and did anything come of that? Thank you.
We'll take the questions in groups of 3, and then we'll come back to the panel. So, Penelope, please.
Yeah, thank you very much to all of you for some very interesting presentations. I have a question for both Linda and Stephen. First of all, I just wanted to, I think one of the gaps in the guiding principles is the way the standards are set out for companies, which makes the rights of women, the rights of Indigenous peoples, and some other groups as additional standards that are not always included. And so I wondered if both of you could comment, first of all, and also the other thing that's set out in the guiding principles is this idea of policy coherence. And I wondered if both of you could comment on, first of all, to what extent do you address the differentiated impacts of companies on women and girls, on Indigenous peoples? For example, resource extraction. There are resource extraction companies in Finland and resource extraction companies in the UK that are operating in other countries. And the second question is, to what extent have you looked at modifying your bilateral investment treaties in order to take account of the ability of those treaties to restrict the capacity of host states to regulate in the public interest? Thanks.
Great. So the first couple questions, really easy, simple answers. But Olga, I'm hoping you add to this.
Sure, I'll try. Thank you very much for your presentations, everybody. I have a question that is for all of you. Okay. And yes, so it's regarding the role of public procurement in the national action plans, and how, as Stephen was saying, it's more of a, rather than a policy setting document, it's an expectation setting document, but to what extent it's present in all of the plans, and how do you see this developing then later, maybe policy and regulation? One of the things that I observed in the UK revised version is that something that we were all really excited about has disappeared, the possibility of mandatory exclusions of companies that, of which information of potential human rights violations exist, to be out of potential bidding to public contracts. And if for what I remember, Maria, in the draft, there was also, and this was quite pioneer at the time, because I remember the EU was doing consultations to pass the new procurement directive. So if you can comment on that very easy and straightforward question too.
Okay, thank you. So while we hear answers on this side, I'm looking at you folks to bring up some questions. So my eyes will be over here. Maria, why don't you start? Take that last question, I think was directed at you, or you're researching?
Yes.
Okay, so Linda, let's go to you. Maybe you can dive into those really simple questions.
Great, thanks. I'll try my best. We try to include vulnerable groups, including women, children, Indigenous people, disabled, etc., in all of our work. And, you know, in every paper we try to make a reference to them, and we talk about them constantly in our work. especially when talking about due diligence and stakeholder engagement. So it's especially women is a priority for Finland, and children as well. So we try to kind of make them part of our work as much as we can. When it comes to stakeholder engagement in Finland and mining, I don't know if you know, but we had this, or still have this very troubled mine, which has kind of brought out this whole stakeholder engagement as a really big topic nationally. And this one very problematic mine has kind of shadowed all the mining industry in Finland, but it's actually that one that has done everything it can wrong. So it's been a huge national issue, and we actually have this quite a good guidance on how to do meaningful stakeholder engagement in the mining sector. It's kind of quite a clear guidance for the mining sector, and it's actually translated in English as well. So there is this big kind of consciousness around that. And when it comes to international activities, this is something that we talk about there as well. The OECD has a very good guidance on meaningful stakeholder engagement in the mining sector as well. So we kind of try our best to kind of raise awareness on stakeholder engagement in our work all the time. I hope that answered your question. Public procurement. For several different reasons, we didn't want to go into mandatory use of social clauses within our national legislation on public procurement. But as I said, we do provide guidance. And the current legislation has several kind of reasons or exclusion clauses for companies or individuals who have committed crimes and have been committed in a court. So I think, I don't remember the whole list, but there is financial crimes and labor offenses. So I see that as a kind of a social issue, so that a company who has clearly committed crimes should and is excluded from public procurement in Finland. I hope that answered.
Great, yeah. Stephen, over to you, but maybe you can also make sure we tackle Penelope's trade question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we'll try. And Doug's question first about our review of remedy. That was one of the commitments from our first action plan, was to do a review. It was done by an organisation called BICL, I think British Institute for Comparative Law, I think is what it stands for. And it's published certainly on their website. I don't know if it's on ours. It was an independent study, so we didn't necessarily agree with everything that was in it. Certainly we'd have differences of opinion on lots of it. But it was really intended to be an independent look at what the provision of remedy was in the UK and how that compared with others, and what the options were really for people bringing cases through UK courts. The judiciary, well, I don't think the judiciary themselves were involved, but the Ministry of Justice was very heavily involved in the development of both action plans. On the question Penelope asked about the standards for companies, and particularly women and indigenous people, I would also again refer to the Council of Europe recommendation, because that definitely has language on indigenous, a whole section on indigenous people, and I think on women and children and other vulnerable groups, and it's on, particularly on remedy and access, and that's very, very good. And I think we also reference them in our action plan. I'm glad that Penelope and Olga talked about trade agreements and public procurement, because they are kind of the two, I'd say, the two trickiest bits. They were the two last bits to be finalised in the action plan, and you know, to be frank, I would have liked to have gone further than the language we were able to get. And that, again, as I said, it reflects sometimes where different ministers and ministries are at the time. Neither of them are finished pieces of work, and the whole thing about the action plan is that it's ongoing and it sets a direction and it sets some expectations, but it's not legislation that has to be repealed or added to. On public procurement, it's something that we're definitely looking at continually. I don't think we haven't looked particularly at the mandatory exclusion, and I know that the Canadians, for example, have rules about that linked to their OECD national contact point. We tend to try to encourage rather than exclusion, but we will have to look at it, I think, both in terms of business and human rights and modern slavery. I always find my view is that it's difficult to be asking companies to do things that you're not prepared to do yourself, but that's my view, and I have to convince others in government. And on trade, again, that's a very ongoing issue. As I said, for reasons I can't quite recall, but we're going to have to develop a lot of trade deals over the coming years. And we are again looking at what they may contain in terms of clauses, and how, what the benchmarks are for that. And we would definitely, from our perspective, we'd definitely be pushing for having strong human rights clauses in there, at least as strong as we've got now. I think that's probably it.
Okay, Maria, do you recall the EU directive and what it said about exclusions? Was that the question?
Yeah, but en aquell moment, sorry, en aquell moment sí que s'estava discutint la directiva de compra pública europea, però parlant amb les persones que portaven aquest tema ens van dir que no s'inclouria temes de drets humans de manera clara, per tant vam dir que aquest no pot ser el referent al qual es faci referència en el Pla Nacional. Buscava una mica quins eren els elements a fora que ens podien consolidar les coses que s'estaven incloent dintre de l'articulat de l'esborrany. L'únic que es va poder incloure era una mesura, la mesura 20, que feia referència a que es farien les modificacions legislatives perquè es tingui en compte el perfil de les empreses en l'accés a subvencions, contractes, etc., denegant els casos en què hi hagi una sentència en ferm que confirmi aquests abusos i que hi hagi una negació per part de l'empresa a reparar aquests fets. I això anava lligat amb una altra mesura, la 21, que era que el govern impulsaria l'ampliació de les competències de la Fiscalia per poder investigar aquells casos on hi haguessin indicis que això hagués pogut estar passant. O sigui, una mica dues mesures que es reforçaven l'una a l'altra.
Great. Okay, I noticed that people on this side of the room are either avoiding eye contact or leaving, so I'm not going to put pressure on you. I'll ask a question on your behalf in solidarity. One of the things that's been discussed a bit in today's conversation is small and medium enterprises. I'd be curious to hear how a national action plan process includes perspectives of small and medium enterprises and also oftentimes the domestic nature of the SME's operations versus the impacts abroad of a transnational corporation. So how did that factor into the developments that you've had in your countries? Maybe Maria, we'll start with you and we'll go this way again. Yeah?
En el moment de reflexió sobre el plan, el que ens vam trobar era que, evidentment, el grau de maduresa dels diferents actors amb els quals s'havia de parlar i els quals s'havia d'involucrar dins del pla era molt diferent. Les grans empreses multinacionals, com ja he comentat abans, per la seva vinculació sectorial a nivell europeu o inclús internacional, ja estaven familiaritzades amb aquest tema, inclús n'hi ha que ja estaven implementant processos de due diligence, molt primaris, però ja tenien en el cap això. I el gran repte era una mica com incorporar els ministeris que d'alguna manera havien d'implementar parts del que era el pla i incorporar a les petites i mitjanes empreses que principalment jo crec per la seva connexió amb les cadenes de valor globals tenen una responsabilitat molt important en aquest sentit. I aleshores, el que jo crec que no sé si es va aconseguir aquí, però que jo crec que és el que s'hauria de fer, és articular un pla que prevegui diferents línies adreçades a cadascun d'aquests col·lectius i d'aquests grups d'interessos i de particularitats. En el cas del Pla espanyol, es va pensar que per les petites i mitjanes empreses faria un portal, molt d'oferir informacions, xerrades, una via inclús de consulta sobre aquest tema, paquetes de coses educatives i formatives i clarificadores. Això a un altre nivell també s'havia pensat a nivell de les ambaixades a fora, doncs també que aquest personal que tracta amb empreses tingués aquesta informació, aquesta formació per orientar les empreses també en aquest sentit. I hi ha un altre nivell, jo crec que era a nivell sectorial, parlar amb les grans empreses, grans empreses transnacionals, per forçar una mica més altres aspectes. Però jo crec que una mica la dificultat és trobar aquest joc on es pugui articular diferents continguts, velocitats, beneficis, interessos i sancions, perquè tothom tingui una mica l'ingredient que necessita per avançar una miqueta més.
Okay, great. Linda.
I think it's important to note that previously 99.8% of our companies were SMEs, but when Nokia's phone manufacturing was sold to Microsoft, the number turned to 99.99%. So we do have a lot of SMEs. What we've noticed throughout the years is that in practice it's impossible for us from the ministry to reach out to SMEs. So it just doesn't work. But we need to identify the contact points where we do meet SMEs. So maybe it's that an SME is applying for some kind of public funding, or they are part of public procurement, or they have recognized that they want to do more international business, be it supply chains or whatever, and they need help with their kind of human rights impact assessments or social impact assessments. So we need to identify all these different points and figure out how we talk with the SMEs and what kind of support and services or demands we can place on them. But what we've noticed that the resources that SMEs have are way, way, way smaller than the multinationals. So there isn't anyone responsible for responsible business conduct. They don't even understand the concept. They don't even necessarily understand how it relates to their work. So you really, really have to put a lot of emphasis on the work on how to reach out to SMEs. What I just learned a couple of weeks ago, because we have this training provided for free for companies on business and human rights, and previously it's been multinationals who have attended, but now there's the next course that is starting, there are medium-sized companies. So I don't know what the reason is, but I'm really happy that it's happening. So that's kind of our experience with SMEs. So I don't. If someone suggests that I'm going to start a tour around Finland talking to SMEs, I think it's a waste of time. We need to kind of identify the spots where it's natural for them to meet us and where we can provide support or whatever, funding. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. If anyone has a really easy question, now would be a good time to ask it. The SMEs is, as Linda said, it's very hard to reach them, and I don't think we were successful in reaching them as part of our consultation exercise. You end up talking to a lot of the big companies again and again. You can talk to associations, but the risk with that is that you go down to a lowest common denominator. I think, again, you hinted at the domestic impacts and international reach, and I think, if we're looking at domestic, then most of our SMEs are covered by UK law. So, we don't have a problem there. The international reach tends to be the bigger multinational companies, and we would tend to try to target SMEs through supply chains of the bigger companies, and so the obligation gets passed down the supply chain. We do also have various services for any company going into an overseas market, either through our embassies providing advice through something called the Overseas Business Risk Service, which advises on risks. So that's kind of how we've done it. I think one exception to that actually is the ICT sector, which obviously has some big players, as you've just referred to, but has a lot of small one-man operations, really, developing software, etc. And we did develop guidance specifically for that sector because the risks there are very different. Your supply chain risks tend, if you're a retailer, your supply chains are about your production and your sourcing, etc. For the ICT sector, it's about where your product ends up being used. So the supply chain is kind of the other way around. So we did provide guidance for that sector and tried to make that. I mean, you referred to 180-page guidance for the textile industry. We tried to make it, simple enough for someone who's not going to be doing this 9 to 5, but just needs to be aware of how you go about due diligence.
Some kind of checklist.
Some kind of checklist, yeah. It was. So that was one sector where we thought that these are SMEs that we need to be reaching, and we did it with the trade association there, but developed the guidance fairly ambitiously.
There's good news. We have a question on this side of the room. The brave soul, you get to start the line of questioning, and then we'll go to some new voices. The lady in the blue, the lady back there, and then up here, and then Penelope. Okay.
Yes? Ok, gràcies. No, era per comentar una mica el que deia la Maria. Jo estic totalment d'acord amb el que tu has dit. Amb les darreres esborranys que hi havia de la proposta de pla, malgrat que podien agradar o no agradar a les empreses, a les organitzacions empresarials, com a les ONGs, jo crec que qui menys agradava eren alguns ministeris que van ser finalment els que van decidir que no es tirés endavant. Jo vull reconèixer, com tu has fet també, el paper important que va fer l'Oficina de Drets Humans del Ministeri d'Exteriors. Jo crec que amb els dos noms que tu has dit eren compromesos plenament amb el text i tot el procés que es va fer en aquest sentit. Dues preguntes. D'aquests rumors que t'han arribat quan vas anar a Madrid fa pocs dies, estem parlant d'un nou document o estem parlant de reprendre el document que s'havia ja treballat? I per una altra banda, un dubte veient les experiències d'altres països com el Regne Unit i Finlàndia. Es va fer un treball d'estudi per saber si s'havien de fer modificacions legals per adaptar el marc legal al Pla Nacional, a les previsions del Pla Nacional, perquè crec que és important en aquest sentit també saber si aquest treball es va fer i si es va fer i en tens coneixement cap a on indicava. Gràcies. Thank you.
Okay, so Maria's going to read the tea leaves after we hear from a few more questions. I'm eager to hear the answer about Madrid too. Please, the lady in the back, yeah.
Okay, I think my question is an easy one. Coming from a perspective from a student, we were talking much about SMEs and how they are being involved and approached and supported in this whole process. So my question is in regards to the civil society as us as students and academic, soon to be academics, how can the civil society be or are there any plans already included in the agendas from governments to have a more wider approach also regarding plans on academic programs for our students to raise awareness apart from speaking to smaller or medium businesses. So I know there are already corporations that work especially on the topic of corporate social responsibility, but are there anything like that included in your governmental agendas?
Okay, so a question about inclusion. Let's go to, I think there was one more back there, wasn't it? Yes, please, Marta. Yeah.
Bueno, yo tenía dos preguntas y un comentario. La primera pregunta sería para la representante del gobierno finlandés. Me ha parecido muy interesante el proceso del que has hablado sobre la elaboración de informes de país cuando se va a proceder a una misión comercial. Entonces, te quería preguntar cuál es el proceso de elaboración de esos informes, si se hace un grupo de trabajo entre varios ministerios, si la sociedad civil tiene algún tipo de participación en el mismo, y luego también si ese tipo de informes han tenido un proceso de cambio en los procesos internos de debida diligencia de las empresas. Luego tenía, un comentario sobre el Plan Nacional de Empresa y Derechos Humanos. Yo también me sumo, ¿no?, al reconocimiento del trabajo de la Oficina de Derechos Humanos, del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores, y aprovechando que está María aquí, también creo que hay que reconocer que el primer borrador de ese plan nacional era el mejor de todos, ¿no? Y también felicitar a la asesoría técnica que tenía la Oficina de Derechos Humanos. Y luego tengo una pregunta para el moderador, porque me ha parecido muy interesante el mapeo inicial que has hecho de los National Baselines Assessments, y te quería preguntar para el ICAR cuál sería el referente de los países que están ya insertos en ese proceso.
Sorry, the translation, I didn't catch that last point, but did one of you understand? Okay. Which? The best country? Oh, model? Okay, okay. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, Worcester, yeah, please.
Thank you. It's a question for the three speakers, but maybe a very short answer. My question is whether this whole discussion on business and human rights is part of a broader discussion on sustainable development and the sustainable development goals. And I'm asking this as a background to the question. So if it is, do you find it that beneficial or not, or counterproductive? And the background to that is that I'm from Belgium. We have an action plan, although we don't have, but we do have. So there is one, but it's not public. But the initiative came initially from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and now the whole debate is parked with the Federal Institute for Sustainable Development. And we're now working with them, but they say we don't know what business and human rights is about, so help us out. And so I'm really in doubt whether it's helpful or really counterproductive to have this whole debate on business and human rights within that broader sustainable development context. And so I wanted to hear whether you have any experience with that. Thank you.
Okay, actually, Penelope, let's take your question now. Let's get it all out on the floor.
So this is a question for all three speakers. I just wanted to sort of pick up on, Stephen, you mentioned that where there's a legal obligation, then you will take action. And so I wanted to push you and then ask the other two panelists as well on this issue, because it's really a bit of a cat and mouse game in terms of a country showing that there's a real commitment to say, well, you know, we don't have extraterritorial obligations under international human rights law, so we're not going to, you know, deal with that and maybe regulate transnationally on that issue. So is the UK, is Finland, and is Spain, are they working on the treaty process? Are you engaged in the treaty process? And if you're not engaged in the treaty process, then what's the official government justification for that? The treaty process on business and human rights I'm referring to. Thank you.
Okay, good questions, everyone. Thank you for that round. So Maria, why don't we start with you? Talk to us about what you heard in Madrid, all the gossip from Madrid, and then where things are going here, and dive into as many of those questions as you can.
Next time I go to Madrid, I bring a bottle of wine. So, but, perdó. En relació al document no ho sé perquè no tenia... però vaig entendre que havia pogut canviar molt, la qual cosa no m'estranyaria, però no em vaig atrevir a preguntar més perquè vaig dir, bueno, que sea lo que Dios quiera, ja, és igual, ja que, bueno... Després, les modificacions legals que comentaves, com que no hi havia pressupost, tot va ser molt... O sigui, s'havia de començar el procediment d'esborrany, de consultes, etc. El que es va fer és posar això com a primera mesura dins del pla. O sigui, el primer que s'ha de fer és mirar quin corpus legal tenim ara que doni suport a la implementació dels principis rectors tant per part de l'Estat com de les empreses i què falta, una mica això. I en relació al treaty process, jo no parlo com a govern, sinó com a coneixedora d'aquest tema. La sensació que he tingut parlant amb el govern era una mica, el govern de l'estat espanyol, era que està una mica a l'expectativa, veient una mica, seguint el que deia la Unió Europea, en aquest sentit, escoltant molt a la societat civil, sí, i com molt oberts a veure què podria sortir, com podia evolucionar aquest tema. També conscients que és un procés molt llarg, d'anys, i que mentrestant també fa falta fer altres coses i veure una mica quin és l'encaix. Sustainable Development? En relació al desenvolupament sostenible i tot el boom ara dels SDGs, etc., la meva impressió és que, evidentment, els SDGs no substitueixen de cap manera als Guiding Principles ni a la necessitat de respecte dels drets humans per part dels estats i de les empreses. S'ha de veure els lligams. Jo crec que ara hi ha exercicis de com creuar indicadors i fer una mica el lligam entre aquests dos moviments i veure una mica què surt d'aquí, però evidentment que les empreses apostin per, jo vull, perquè el meu sector és alimentació, doncs jo em vull vincular a l'SDGs, em sembla que és el 2, de fam, relació a la fam. Això no els exonera d'haver de fer una due diligence, de saber quin és l'impacte de les seves activitats, dels seus negocis, en totes les seves operacions i en relació a tots els països on estan. Per mi són coses diferents que poden anar lligades en alguns punts, però que no és exclusiu. I de la mateixa manera, els Guiding Principles, sense una visió de sostenibilitat, tampoc tenen sentit. O sigui que ha de buscar una mica l'encaix.
Okay, Linda.
Thanks. I don't know if I understood correctly the student inclusion question, but in Finland we have at least 3 different programs in universities in Turku, Tampere and Helsinki, which are focused on responsible business conduct. So there is training available for students who want to become experts in this field, and obviously there's a huge demand. So that's why the universities are training students to become experts on this field. It's a growing industry, so to say. So that's why we didn't refer to student programs in our action plans, because we already knew that there were several ones already functioning, and apparently they are very popular as well, as I noticed this winter when I was looking for a summer intern. There's a surge of very good applicants. So I don't know if that answered your question.
I think it was also about the involvement of groups like academics and civil society in the National Action Plan process.
They were very involved, so and are still involved. We work with civil society all the time. They are very involved in our roundtables and dialogue building in all our exercises. So we really want to keep them involved, and they are really, really involved. Country-specific RBC memos. So, as I said, it was kind of asked from us by companies, and so we created this memo or a base for a memo with really simple questions. What is the situation concerning child labor or corruption or environmental legislation or labor law in a said country? And then when there's a trade mission that base for a memo is used, and then the embassy writes the report, and then our foreign ministry checks it, and then they send it to me, and then I send it to Finn Partnership, which is a public financing instrument, and then they publish it online. So there's this whole chain of process where we provide the information. But it's kind of, we made a quite a simple set of questions so that it would be easy for an embassy to write out the memo. SDGs, I think there are a lot of linkage documents now available, which kind of link business and human rights and SDGs. I see it as kind of as Marie said, kind of a complementary tool. It hasn't bothered me yet, which is a good thing, but it cannot replace, as Marie said, business and human rights issues or due diligence ever. But maybe it's a way for businesses to tell what they are doing. That's at least how I see it. But it cannot replace business and human rights work. It's a complementary tool. And then finally, if I remember all the questions correctly, it was about the legal action and extraterritorial legislation and the treaty process. It has to be said that in Finland we haven't been overly enthusiastic about the treaty, but obviously the European Union represents us in the negotiations. And originally there were a lot of countries within the European Union who said that they don't want to even go into the room. From the start, we have been saying inside the EU that we want to go into the room and tell others what we've been doing and what the issues are for us, and kind of voice out our concerns. And luckily now, after some long negotiations, the EU has decided to at least go into the same room where the negotiation on the treaty is happening. Obviously, there are huge issues left, but maybe our national stance is that we don't see it as a magical tool that will fix all the problems in the world. But we are more than willing to tell people what we are doing and what we see the issues are. So kind of a proactive attitude. I don't know if it works, but that's where we stand.
Thank you. Yeah, I understood the inclusion point similarly as working both ways, and like Finland, our civil society was very active in the consultation process and continues to be, and continues to challenge us regularly. And there are several UK universities that are very active on this, including Essex, Nottingham, to name a couple. One of the UN working group members is a professor at the University of Exeter, so there's a lot of expertise within the UK academic sphere. On SDGs, I see it as broadly complementary. I mean, certainly SDG 8.7 helps us on modern slavery, so that gives us a hook there. There's SDGs on civic participation, etc. So I think there's lots of things in the SDGs that support the work of business and human rights. I don't see it as a challenge. But I mean, apart from the SDGs, you've also got, as Amal referred to earlier, G7, G20 commitments on this, which is useful international consensus around developing action plans. On the treaty process, as Linda said, there's an EU position, so naturally we follow that. We were engaged, or we attended the meeting last October in Geneva. I imagine we'll attend the next one, whenever it is. I think our concerns about it are similar, though, that it was begun as a political gesture rather than a particular answer to a particular problem. We would prefer to have worked out what the gaps were and what the mechanism needed to address them was, rather than a sort of knee-jerk response that the UNGPs don't work, therefore we need a treaty, but we don't know what the treaty will do. I think, and it's also worrying that a lot of the countries saying that the UNGPs don't work haven't actually tried to implement them. None of the sponsors really have national action plans. So we remain cautious about what its opportunity to deliver is. And we were particularly cautious that it ran the risk of diverting an awful lot of time and attention away from the implementation of the national action plans. That said, we were very supportive of processes that looked sensibly at remedy, as the OHCHR study of gross human rights abuses did, supportive of the OECD guidelines, supportive of other mechanisms. But for now, we'll be sort of cautiously engaged. I don't really see it going anywhere in the short term.
I'm going to take a stab at the question Marta had about the best NAP. I think we, at least in civil society, we at ICAR have done an analysis of all of the NAPs that have been released. You can find all of that information at, I think it's nationalactionplan.us or at the ICAR website, and you'll see an assessment of the NAPs. We looked at, in fact, the NAPs that, I don't think I have it on this slide, but the one that we're holding up now as sort of where others could go is the Colombian National Action Plan. In our assessment, that it has, in terms of all of the criteria, has the strongest elements of those criteria met. But that being said, each of these is a first effort of their governments, so we hope that they iterate and become better over time. The one thing I'll ask the panelists about now, as we close up this panel, I know people are getting hungry for lunch, is it was interesting, this question about the SDGs, and I think you all took it to be whether or not the SDGs would replace the guiding principles or could replace the energy on business and human rights. I worry about it slightly differently, whether energy around the SDGs and this whole financing for development agenda, which is very much hinged upon the private sector being the mechanism by which we engage in development aims, whether that displaces the guiding principles and efforts at strengthening standards on business and human rights. So what I mean by that is whether that takes up so much more time and space on your desks that where you would or where governments would continue to develop perhaps into standards and processes on business and human rights are now taken up by this space about viewing the private sector as the means of achieving development aims. So I'll ask you that question. I'll also ask you a sort of reflective question. Sitting back now, having developed national action plans or hoping that the Spanish government does so in the next year or two, what would you note as critical missing pieces that could have led to stronger results? Meaning, you hear demands from civil society all of the time, and then you weigh those against equities that business and business associations voice. If civil society were to be pleased with a national action plan, what would need to change? Does that question make sense? Okay, those are my two questions.
I'm always the first. The first question, what was it?
About the displacement, the
That
energy around SDGs,
yes.
not replacing, but taking time.
Well, la meva sensació és que sí que, com diu Alà, hi ha com una pressió molt forta, jo crec que amb els governs i amb les empreses de posar a l'agenda d'una manera molt contundent aquest tema, els ODS. I no sé encara quina serà la resposta de les empreses, o sigui, perquè és relativament curt el temps que portem des de diferents institucions dient-los aquest és un tema que també heu d'abordar. No ho sé què... Jo el que sé és que les empreses a nosaltres ens comencen a preguntar i això com ho farem i què té a veure amb els guiding principles i com hem de reportar una cosa i l'altra i com tot això s'articula i com li donem sentit a nivell intern per explicar-ho a la nostra gent i com, no sé, una mica la sensació que tenen les empreses és aquesta, de com puc gestionar això perquè els inversors m'estan preguntant coses de drets humans, quins són els meus impactes, com ho faig, què faig, si estic fent una due diligence o no. I per altra banda, doncs, de cara a l'exterior també ens interessa recolzar el moviment internacional que hi ha davant dels SDGs. Jo ara tinc pocs elements ara per acabar de veure què passa. I en relació a les critical pieces missing, jo vaig tenir la sensació una mica en el procés, i això és molt personal meu, i no tot de l'equip que va estar darrere d'això, que va faltar, i crec que potser falta en alguns contextos, que cadascú surti de la seva zona de confort. Les ONGs es van portar molt com unes ONGs, les empreses molt com empreses, el govern molt com govern, tothom blindant, inclús de cara als pares, a les discussions entre pares. I jo crec que potser hagués estat, no sé, útil sortir d'aquesta zona de confort, situant-nos tots en un nivell, en un plànol de discussió diferent, per ser capaços d'imaginar alguna cosa diferent del que tots individualment teníem al cap. I jo crec que potser una de les coses que s'hauria de fer, no sé com, però bueno, és tenir aquesta capacitat de dir, amb tots els meus aprenentatges, la meva experiència, la meva posició en relació a uns temes, com puc deixar una mica això de banda i pensar en alguna cosa que sigui més, no vull parlar de consens perquè hi ha coses que no es poden consensuar perquè una té una visió i l'altra l'oposada, però sí com intentar estar en un plànol diferent de debat, de discussió i de construcció.
Great. I don't know if I have a good answer to the SDG question. I honestly don't know what's going to happen and what the risks are. What I've been asked by companies a lot is that, what is this and how does business and human rights relate to this? And, I don't know. I don't have a good answer. We'll see. And if a crisis emerges, we'll have to act accordingly. Then about what the civil society would want from our business and human rights work. I don't know how well you know the Finnish political system, but we have a very rich party system, so we have a lot of different parties within the parliament, and the previous government was very rainbow-like, so that it was from left to right and the Green Party in the middle, or actually the country party in the middle. But anyway, so usually our governments have been, there's always this balance. And since time immemorial, our governments have said that they one of their first priorities is not to cause administrative burden to companies. So that's like always on governmental programs as number one. But this current government that we have, which is a really right-wing government, they are really adamant about it. So they are not going to create any legislation concerning companies outside of what's happening in the European Union and with the threshold defined in the European legislation. So that's the state of play at the moment, and that's how we have to act until told otherwise. With that being said, I would imagine that our civil society would want us to create more legal requirements for due diligence, business and human rights due diligence to be specific, as the one in France. And they would also want for more legislation on non-financial reporting with lower size thresholds. So that's what the civil society wants. The next election is going to be in 2019, so we'll see what the next government says, but this is the state of play for the moment.
Okay, Stephen?
Thank you. Just quickly on your comparison of the best in class on NAPs, I'm not going to challenge that, don't worry, but I think one of the important points to recognise is that they are all different because they, so it's very difficult to compare because you're comparing very different things. So the Colombian one is very specific to the issues faced by Colombia. You know, the Netherlands one is constructed in a very different way to ours. So they are all quite different, which makes it difficult to compare. But the important thing is that a NAP should be addressing the particular challenges of your country and listening to your stakeholders as well. On displacement of SDGs and displacement of effort, I don't see that as a massive problem for us, partly because we've got the NAP through the door. It might be a problem in other countries that haven't got that far down the line. But I think the other thing is that I mean, I do see it in policy terms as being quite supportive of the UNGPs. But I think the other thing is that the ball is already rolling in the corporate sector, frankly. The UNGPs have got the corporate sector working, and you know, we've heard lots about the reporting initiatives, the due diligence approaches, etc. And that's going to carry on because, frankly, for a company, your reputational risk is a much bigger driver than anything in an action plan. So, I think that that ball is already rolling, and I think that's going to be upset by the SDGs. In terms of what civil society would want, our civil society is absolutely delighted with our NAP. They don't want any more. They couldn't be happier. Couldn't be happier. I suspect that if you ask them if they're here, it's around remedy again. It's around tougher remedy, more ability to hold companies to account through UK courts. That sort of keeps coming back. I would, what I would want more from is probably around the government commitments, the public procurement, the trade stuff. But I think civil society tends to say, well, it's nice to have a NAP, but if you can't bring a case to a court, then it hasn't got the teeth, and that tends to be what they ask for.
All right, so we have made it through the second session on lights and shadows about national action plans. We heard a lot of the benefits, some of the challenges, some of the successes, some of the things that could have gone better. So I hope it was an illustrative and illuminating discussion for you, particularly as Spain grapples with this discussion now. So we are ending a bit early. Pablo, I don't know where you are, but I hope that's okay. Yeah. Oh, I guess what time is it supposed to end? 2:15, right? Yeah. So now it's time for lunch, and then we shall resume the next session, which is going to be an excellent session at 3:45, moderated by Olga, who is another academic from the UK that is sort of top of class on public procurement, but she's not going to be talking about that. No, she's going to be talking about extraterritorial obligations. And so I'm telling you, this is going to be a really excellent session, so I'm looking forward to having the debate that hopefully Olga will help steer around whether extraterritorial obligations exist or should exist. So for now, join me in thanking our speakers and our governments for their leadership on business and human rights, flawed as it is, but at least it's leadership, and we need to see more of that. So thank you.